Past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would. The Past investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would.
That's right. And today is Monday, April 7th, 2025. And we're going to be talking tonight just briefly about weaponized migration. This is actually kind of a continuation of a conversation that we started on in print anyway, and on X in response to a post by Elon Musk. We found out it was to a group of people in Italy. He was doing a kind of a live stream to them. And he basically mentioned the dynamics. So he was describing the forces of unregulated mass migration and the detrimental effects that it would have on a nation. And he defined the nation as not the land, but the people within it. And he didn't use so many terms, but that's true. So it's not a geographical region, right? So a country isn't just a geographical region. That's part of it. The main part of a nation is, of course, the social grouping, right? The social organizational structure dictates outcome. So a number of factors are interrelated there, but primarily you can boil it down in broad strokes. You call it a culture, a people that defines a nation. And then within that, you have the social agreement, whether it's understood implicitly and written down in a constitution, or whether it's a social grouping based on tradition forever, like the First Nations and peoples in America, where they had a social contract that was simply understood because you were part of the group. It's the cohesion, whether, again, written and explicit or unwritten and implied by social tradition, that binds the people together. And that cohesion is what keeps that organization from falling apart and falling at each other's throats. And on a good day, even the best of organizations, without any outside stressors, will have problems. The United States entered a civil war and many other periods of civil unrest without mass migration. It's just the normal stresses and strains of large organizations. A large family, even a small family, will have strains within it. That's just the nature of the human condition. It's who we are and how we operate biologically and socially. And so you magnify one person and their interaction a million times or a billion times, depending how big the nation is, and you can already see it's already very tenuous. That ability to maintain cohesion, control, and a peaceful, prosperous nation. Every day it's a roller coaster ride. And so to introduce a massive destabilization, such as mass unvetted migration, creates a huge stressor because it's right on the inside. And it's just same as a biological organism. If you introduce a bunch of cells that are not part of the host body, a couple of things will happen. And one of those possibilities is that it takes over the host. It simply overwhelms the cells within that host, and it takes over and it becomes something completely different. The other thing is that there's an autoimmune response from the host to the cells that came in, and it so weakens that host that other organisms come from outside and consume the host. So it consumes both the host and the massive amount of foreign cells that were introduced into that host, and a number of other things. But that's primarily what we're looking at. And what Elon, I think, missed, or maybe not missed, but when he reposted it, a lot of people didn't understand that the weaponized migration, or the use of migration to bring down or subjugate other nations, has a very long and storied history. It's not something that came lately. It's something that actually has been in existence for quite some time. And so what we're looking at is being able to provide a few examples of it, and kind of invite you to look at some of the links that we have, especially on our Substack link. Delve into the sources, look a bit more. If there's any questions, any debates, feel free to come back and kind of debate us on it, or bring up some points that we can look at, some salient points. But it really is a good lesson learned. Why that's probably one of the most dangerous things that you can do to a nation is introduce a tremendous amount of unvetted mass migration, because a couple of things happen. What you want to do is you always want to introduce to the ability that that host nation or the host organism is able to adapt to, that both cells adapt to one another. There's always a matter of adaptation. One doesn't just adapt to the other. There's always an osmotic, even of ideas, there's kind of an osmosis, right? So that people can kind of trade ideas and do those sorts of things. Well, the same with a number of immigrants that come to the United States, which has always been within our history. No one's talking about sealing the borders completely. At least I don't think that's ever been there. Legal migration has always been within American history. What we're talking about is mass unvetted migration, which has been a weapon of war for quite some time, a weapon of war, colonization, and conquest. It's just the way it has been. But for some reason, it's not being discussed or talked about. And that seems to be a void within the collective consciousness or understanding within the United States. And as such, it's quite dangerous. If nobody understands what happens with the dangers of electricity, and you're running around trying to put things in sockets, you're going to probably shock yourself or kill yourself. And that's what we're doing now. We don't understand the hazards, the historical hazards that this entails. So we're going to look at a couple of things here, one of which is not in our article, but I did want to talk about. There's a number of things that with the weaponized migration in history that the goals were designed to do. One of us was simply blackmail in some ways, right? In other words, you're threatening the other nation with sending in a bunch of migrants that would be a burden to the other nation. It would cause a lot of disruption. And so you're kind of threatening them with it. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to extort from the other nation some sort of political concession or a financial payment, as East Germany did to West Germany in the 80s. They actually brought in a number of workers from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and were basically extorting West Germany because they were kind of moving them over into West Germany because they brought them over promising them jobs, and there's nothing there. So West Germany had to negotiate with East Germany in order for East Germany to stop that. So that's kind of the simple level in that one. Then you have basic destabilization, such as Pakistan did with India. I believe it was in the 70s, where there was about 1 million migrants came from East Pakistan flooding into India, and India was complaining because that was very destabilizing on the border, those border towns. It was creating this violence because of that tension that had developed between India and Pakistan. Of course, they'd once been the same nation, but over time, because of the way they had been set up, that now became a friction point, and the spilling over of those borders created a threat that India would destabilize, and it could lead to a general war between Pakistan and India. And so that was another reason that, another effect that you can have with that mass migration. The other one is as agents of influence. So you're not looking per se for a kinetic, but you can shift and shape the voting. You can shift and shape the foreign policy and domestic policy, mostly foreign policy of other nations. Russia had done this throughout the Soviet period, and then in the initial phases of the CIS, they were able to kind of use the Russian diaspora to become voting blocks, and in some cases leadership blocks in other nations that would then push for pro-Russian policies within that new host nation. And so the transformation of the host nation to do things and vote in ways that's not in its self-interest, it's in a foreign government self-interest, is another mechanism that you can use the diaspora for, or the weaponized migrants. So it's not kinetic per se, but it is destructive, because eventually it will weaken. You're working on behalf of another nation. You're not working on behalf of your own nation, right? So it subverts the citizens, and it subverts their ability to be able to progress forward in their own interest and the national interest. It's subverted. Hijacked, if you will. So that's another one. The other one's economic. So a lot of people don't realize that sometimes you can actually do it's a form of raiding, so that you can go forward into another country and you have remittances, right? Western Union is famous for this. In fact, we talked to a district attorney or assistant district attorney who was investigating a lot of this from a big state when we were down looking at some things in the South, and he had the information of phenomenal part of the investigation, a phenomenal amount of money. We're talking almost $1 billion was leaving the United States, and from one state alone over time to go to these other nations through Western Union. So these mom and pop shops were coming up. They were selling. There was like illegal cigarette manufacturing, so the ATF was getting involved. There was some bootlegging going on. Mostly it was cigarettes, but it was some bootlegging. A lot of illicit. There was counterfeit goods that were coming in. So this was kind of an economic raid. Using a mass migrant network that would go through, and then there was robbery groups that were going through. They were moving cars across borders. They were stealing, all sorts of high value electronics, and they were moving them out of the country, or reselling them, and then moving the cash out of the country. So basically, it was a raid. It was an economic raid upon the United States by basically it was two other countries that were doing that. So you're draining your resources, you're being robbed, and it's hitting your citizens because the ability for these groups to operate in a cohesive network was actually pretty high. And the U.S. law enforcement was having some problems because these groups were being sheltered and facilitated by what the law enforcement locally was thinking was a federal government. Well, it was a contractor to the federal government. So it created some an interesting situation. But that's the present day. That's not quite history, but it does. You can see that elsewhere in history where poorer nations will send their large groups to work, but then they'll take that money out of the nation back into their own nation. And if a nation is large enough, for example, the United States at certain parts of its history, and the other nation is small enough, for example, South Korea during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it doesn't matter. It's a drop in the bucket. It wouldn't affect the United States. However, depending on the state where this occurs, that state may lose enough of its tax revenue, that basis, and it could actually economically depress certain states that are depressed, like Mississippi, certain states in the South. So you have to, and other countries as well, they don't have enough GDP to be able to do that. They happen to get a lot of revenue elsewhere, but those remittances can actually raid the treasury and put it somewhere else. So that's another factor. And then the final factor is to create enough disruption, physical disruption, that you're creating a civil war, you're creating an insurgency, you're creating kinetic violence within a nation. And you'll see that a lot, for example, in Africa, the Middle East recently, but throughout history, moving populations somewhere else so that those groups will fight each other benefits the outsider, the third party. So it weakens something that's there. The British, of course, were famous for this. They would move populations around in order to foster that. Stalin was very famous for it. He had actually cut his teeth in the early Soviet by being the ethnic commissar. So he would look at the ethnicities and minorities, and he would say, okay, he knew who didn't historically get along with who. And if they were geographically separate, he knew if I move them together, if I move them apart, or I move them around, you can manipulate them because they're too busy fighting each other than to fight another group. And so being able to play one group against another benefits the third party. So, for example, with the United States, it would be moving in to weaken the United States. It focuses internally versus being able to defend externally, and creates a huge problem. Plus, again, another resource drain, because your money's not going to economic prosperity or services. Your money is now going toward defending internally, right? Your internal security mechanisms. So there's a lot of the issues with this one. And the examples that we'll talk about here are kind of, for me, were very interesting. I didn't realize that the Russian program was so long lasting. And we'll actually go over here to the presentation, actually the web page that we use. It was an U.S. Army article, but it goes into, it's a third generation. So hopefully everyone can see that one. Actually, let me move it up to this screen. There we go. So this is an article that and the link is on our Substack and our Twitter. So if you go to our Twitter and you'll look at where we post about this in our Substack, you're going to see this. And there we go. So basically what we're looking at here is the czars were utilizing a Russian diaspora. They were pushing people forward, whether it's 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 forward into the borders as they kind of moved out into both the Balkans, and then as they moved across the Urals and eventually to go into Siberia and into the Asia. They would use settlers. They kind of had the settler, basically it was settler colonialism, and they would move them forward and gradually seed the areas and then take it over, because the government had a casus belli, right? Because you have to take care of your citizens. The same thing that the British were doing for the workers that they had moved up into the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. They were using this as a casus belli, as an excuse. But it's not a small program. It actually started with the czars. It got them all the way over into Siberia. So it was very effective. And gradually, when the Soviets took over, they used the same policy. Stalin, of course, being famous, but it didn't end with Stalin, didn't start and didn't end with Stalin. He simply adapted some of the czarist policies and then used the Soviet language around it to kind of give it a different justification. But organizational structure dictates outcome. It's the same organizational structure. It's the same thing. They just inherited it from the czars. And interestingly, you'll see here, it actually talks about the centralization. They actually used it when it transitioned to the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS, after the Soviet Union transitioned out after Yeltsin, and especially when Putin comes into power. you see that they picked that mantle from the czars and the Soviets back up again. And this time they're using the diaspora to be able to shape and influence foreign policy. They were also using it to create the frictions or exacerbate already existing frictions within Ukraine. And they now have a Russian area. So in other words, if you move your population into an area, you gain legitimacy for claims of that area, right? Because you have more of a population. Where else have we heard this from? Of course, from in the 1930s, when the Nazis took over in Germany, you begin to see that same mechanism that they were using ethnic Germans as an excuse, as a casus belli for claims of political control and eventually military control of that area. Now, it's interesting when the two socialists fought each other, when Nazis fought the Russians, or the Nazis fought the communists in World War II, they were doing those same policies. They were moving out the Slavs and they were moving in the Germans into the Eastern Front area, wherever the Germans were able to occupy in Russia. They were still doing those same things. Note that the Soviets, when they took over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, one of the things they did was move people out of those areas and resettle them in different areas in Russia. So they were using Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians. They were moving them over into oblasts, is what they call their provinces, over in the eastern Russia, which is Asia, and that they were displacing the locals there. They moved even Koreans. They had Koreans that were up in the Siberian area. And then when Korea became under Japanese rule, they had a number of ethnic Koreans. They moved them to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. So they were very famous for moving other populations around. They're very adept at it. And if you'll notice some of the Soviet archives that came out, they're very, very good at understanding the differences in the separation and the friction points between cultures. And they know how to exacerbate it using propaganda and disinformation. So it's very, very long program. They're very good at it, and they continue it to this day. Here's a good part. I'll just read it straight from the article. Again, this is a great one at the Army University Press, army.mil. The link is over on our Substack page and our Twitter page. Definitely recommend. This is a good starting point to see the program itself. And again, this is just Russia. China has one that literally is 10, maybe orders of magnitude, almost 100 times. It could be larger than the Russian one. I'd have to look more into it, but it's definitely much magnitudes greater than the Russian one, which is phenomenal for their global influence. But we'll just read the Russian one here. So it says, over the last decades, Russia has espoused soft power policy, hoping to benefit from Russian diaspora with the help of these policies. Vladimir Mukamil points out that the state policies regarding Russian compatriots living abroad are funded separately within the federal budget and list state institutions supporting the Russian diaspora. And then it goes into a list of about, it's about 12 different organizations here that it does. Everything from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, what you would expect, federal agency for the CIS. There's a compatriots living abroad, the International Humanitarian Cooperation. Then you have some you wouldn't. There's the Federal Migration Services of Russia. There's the Russian Center of International Scientific and Cultural Cooperation under the direction of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Federal Agency for Education, subject to Ministry of Education and Science. Moscow city government, and the city of St. Petersburg government. So some you would expect, some you wouldn't expect. For example, the city of Moscow and the city of St. Petersburg, but those are resources that are going to support the overseas Russians that would make sure that they stay within and support that Russian foreign policy. And you see here, just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs transfers about 400 million rubles to the Russian government programs for compatriots through its embassies. So there's money, there's organization, so you have means, motive, opportunity to be able to kind of shape this out there. And it's interesting because there's something very similar to the Confucius Institutes. It looks like Russia may have kind of looked at its SEO partner and said, hey, let's do something similar. And it's the Ruski Mir Foundation, or Russian World, and it helps develop policies in the Russian diaspora and conducts activities related to public diplomacy. So as it promotes kind of culture and language through its 65 centers in the globe, and it's got about 500 million rubles with private companies and the federal government, it pushes those out there. And through that cultural opening, it moves its political will. Now, that's a continuation from the Soviets. Everybody remembers the Soviets. They would move the Bolshoi ballet. They were very big on trying to promote Soviet culture as a foreign policy. In some cases, it was a showcase. Others, it was to manipulate. Now, there wasn't a lot of overseas Russians that weren't anti-communist at the time, but there was enough that they could shape. Now you have a tremendous amount of ethnic Russians all over the area. In fact, let's go over here. I'm going to switch something real quick just to show you. So we're going to head and remove this. I'm going to start the next one. Go ahead and start this. And what this is a slide about some of the foreign Russians, the overseas Russians, or the Russian diaspora, as they said, that are already outside, some of the nations that are big. So this is China here. This is, whoops, let me go back and share this. Two-stage process. There we go. And so these are the charts here. This is the Russian diaspora, countries with the highest populations. So as you would expect, the Ukraine is at 8,300,000 overseas Russian. This is from 2024 numbers. And of course, different census years, but this was compiled in 2024 by Maps Interlude over the Maps Interlude WordPress.com. It's pretty good to be able to put some information in there and see in a graphic form a lot of data, which is good. The next one is the United States, which surprises a lot of people. So Ukraine, of course, 8,300,000. The United States has 3,100,000 ethnic Russians that came over that are potentially susceptible to Russian influence. Kazakhstan, of course, it's a border over there. It's part of the SEO alliance area. Brazil. Now, this is interesting. Everybody knows Brazil and Argentina being hotspots for some of the German immigrants after World War II and during World War II, actually, to be able to try to shape and manipulate Brazilian foreign policy. The U.S. had a tremendous amount of foreign policy initiatives to be able to counter some of those, both the Japanese and the Germans in South America, mostly because of that large settler community that was down there in Central America as well. So you see here, there's 1.8 million Russians in Brazil alone, Germany 1.2 million, and the list goes on. Of course, you always have to add Canadian numbers into American numbers because they're right there. They can just come across the border, because once you get Canadian citizenship, it's fairly easy. We haven't stopped the northern border yet, but judging on the politics, who knows? This is the Chinese, overseas Chinese. Now, interesting to look at this one. The big one is Thailand. Now, the borders are fairly close. There are what we call Sino-Thai, that the CCP, through their overseas operation, attempts to kind of move anyone that was in what's the understood boundaries of modern China. They try to say that it's 4,000-year-old, 5,000-year-old, and if you came from there, you're part of this new CCP ruled occupied Asian area, and you're under their laws. And they will do extradition. They literally will snatch people out of other nations to bring them back to China and disappear, right? So they're brutally murdered, tortured, or worse. And believe it, there can be worse things in China than brutally tortured and murdered. And so Thailand is definitely within their sphere of influence. The Kra Isthmus is a vital transoceanic route that would cut out Singapore, reduce times, and provide a more secure transit for ships, very much like the Panama Canal is there in Central America. And the ability, if Thailand goes, it's a valuable ally. The United States knew this in World War II. The OSS was over there with working with the SETI Thai, or the Free Thai, to be able to gain that area. And once we had that area, we were able to beat back most of the communist insurgencies that were around in that area. In addition, if you hold Thailand, you're able to, it's kind of the pivot point. It's the heart of Southeast Asia. And that was really the rock or the bulwark that you could spring operations forward. So it's kind of the Panama of of Asia, or Panama is the Thailand of Central America, whichever way you want to look at it. But it's very important geographical spot. And there's 9,400,000 Chinese migrants there. I was in Laos. I worked I was one of the first people outside of a medical mission that was from the embassy, or sponsored by the embassy, to do an engagement with Laos. And this was back in 2007. And our translator that was given to us by the Laotian government, her husband actually worked to get them into the World Trade. He was working to try to get Laos into the World Trade Organization. And it was interesting because those numbers down there, it says there's 180,000. Those numbers are actually low. She knew there was 300,000 that were coming in. This is 2007. 300,000 had been allowed to come into Laos, which it didn't have that large of a population anyway. And she said that in a couple of generations, there'll be over 1 million of them, right? Within one generation, you could technically have 2 generations. You could have about 1 million Chinese. And she said, they'll never go away. We'll become China. She said, she was very candid. She said, the Americans come in, we have to listen to horrible, loud music and, drink Coca-Cola, and, you guys have a good time. And then that's it, right? It's annoying, but it's not going to take us over. They said the Chinese come in and we become Chinese. And so they were very worried about that happening. And so we can see, imagine in Thailand, that's going on right now. There was an earthquake in Thailand, and the one building that everybody saw on the news that collapsed, that was run by a Chinese company. So the standards within Thailand will go down, and we will see which way that goes, because historically that Thailand is a key central location, probably not lost in the Chinese, and that may be why there's 9,400,000 there. So that's a very dangerous situation that we're looking at. And again, that migration pattern will influence Thai politics. They will seed in and move in. They will connect with the Sino-Thai, convince them to create the fantasy of some ethnic Chinese race, and therefore you have to listen to Beijing and not listen to Bangkok. So that's a very dangerous condition that's there in Southeast Asia. Malaysia, just below, is 7 million. And again, a lot of them were brought over from the British colonial period when it was British occupied Malaysia. So that's a dangerous position. Look at America. There's 5,500,000. Now there's illegal numbers can add about 1 million to this. And again, you have to add the Canadian numbers. So you're looking at almost about 9, potentially 10 million Chinese, ethnic Chinese, are within the United States and Canada. And then over time, because of the propaganda, the disinformation campaign, information wars, they believe that the CCP is the best representative of China. And so we have shot ourselves kind of in the foot when we didn't recognize Taiwan anymore and our lack of historical understanding about the brutalities and about what the CCP actually is and what the history of what we call China actually is. It's really an empire. It's not a nation. It's an empire of a lot of occupied peoples and nations that operates much like the Ottomans, much like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so, but the overseas, they all want to say it's one big race, right? Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer out of Beijing. And so this is a very dangerous situation. You see, they have the numbers to be able to do it. They have the means, they have the motive, and they definitely have the opportunity to be able to affect massive amounts of change. Now, look where they're both going. Both China and Russia are focused also on Brazil. Russia really left Asia to the Chinese. But now we see that the Chi-Coms are really heavily into Brazil. And so if we add those numbers up here, let's take a look at that. Brazil is 255,000 Chinese there. And we know they're moving also into Panama. They're moving into Guatemala. And over here, the Russians in Brazil were 1.8 million. And remember, they're allies right now in the SCO. So you have a tremendous amount of potential for shaping that environment in South America. So that's a key piece to kind of keep in mind as part of this weaponization as they move forward. But that's current events. Let's go back to talking about the Tsarist events. So what we said before, this all started back with the Tsars and how they were able to move across Russia. So remember, the initial Russians was, more of the kind of a Viking colony that came down, and they would trade along the rivers into the Middle East and into the caliphate that was running here, the Islamic Caliphate in the Black Sea. They had trading posts, and they went further afield. Some say down even into Africa. So they were wide-ranging group, and then they eventually settled and merged in with the peoples that were already settled here and creating the Rus Kingdom, which became Russia, later on Russia. So just from 1300, so here we can see, of course, the dark green areas are the ones that were already done at 1300. Remember, the Mongols came over, so for a time they were busy fighting Mongols, and they were busy fighting Europeans that were campaigning up. So they were pretty much contained a little bit here until about the 1700s. And you see, they began to. Russia always has a identity problem. I think it was the term. I wish I remember the historian that said it, but it was basically that Russia cannot decide if it's an Asian or a European power. It is torn between the two. And it's just the geography, and especially as they moved eastward, they became more and more of an Eastern power. And it was very difficult to say, are they integrated with the West or not? So if you look here, you'll see that the Russia gradually moves over and then moves down. And then some of these parts were given back. For example, they did invade Manchuria, that they were there, or Manchukuo area. They gave it back, and then the Japanese took it over. They were into areas around Xinjiang, which is not shown here, but they did invade Xinjiang area in the 1920s and 30s. And they did take over Mongolia. Mongolia became a puppet state for the Russians, again, just after the Soviet Union took over. So there's actually a little bit more expansion on this map with puppet states that they were able to set up in these areas and some raids that they did. But essentially, except for Mongolia and others, they ceded it along each step of the way. They seeded it with settlers, and then it became their problem. Why? Because it's filled with Slavs and with Russians. And that's how they move forward. Remember, World War I, that happened over here with Austro-Hungary, because they were concerned about the Slavs and how they were being treated by the Austro-Hungarians. And so that is what they begin to look at. That is the march that the Russians did to the east and into the Baltics and into other nations, but it was done again through moving populations forward. So reading this one, it says, the implementation of the Tsarist resettlement policy continued and intensified. Thousands of Russians were settled in small group in 3 Baltic states, in the Muslim states of Central Asia and in Siberia, where they established their own cities. Keep in mind, they established their own cities. Now, where have we heard that? There's a big case in Texas where there's an Islamic group that is setting up their own city, not just a neighborhood, their own city. They'll have their own police, mayor, taxation, law, all of this sort of thing. So that is a mechanism by which you can set up your internal colonization, if you will. By the end of the 18th century, Russians occupied most of the lands about what is Kazakhstan border today, the Altai Mountains, and the whole basin of the Ural River. Russian expansionism increased in the 20th century in Central Asia, and the socio-political changes in Russian Empire brought on by the Russian Revolution. During the revolution, approximately 250,000 peasants were sent to neighboring communist states under the policy of collectivization. Russians who migrated to these parts of what had become the Soviet Union played an important role after the 1930s, helped to industrialize those remote regions, colonizing it further. Now, we should keep in mind when we say colonization, there's different types of colonization. And in this one, I'm going to put my camera back on. In this one, what we're talking about colonization, there's colonization. In fact, I'm going to take this off here. There we go. So 2 types of colonization. What we're talking about is settler colonization. So the British form of colonization, except for a couple of cases, was they were interested in the resources, not the land. And so you had kind of overseas colonies that they would say, well, we still need the people that live there to work there, right? So they still need to work, and they need to bring us the resources back out. So we want the people there to work it. We're going to send the administrators and do it that way. And then the British would move people around. So they would move, typically they would have some Sikhs that would come in, depending on the period and the location, but they would use Sikhs to come in to be the enforcers. They would bring the ethnic Han, or some Chinese, different, there's Cantonese and different groups, but what we call Chinese, they would bring them in from Hong Kong that they had to be able to be administrators, and they would move people around, and they would actually set up different, like an apartheid system, depending where it was, with different schools. We learned this in Malaysia. They actually set up 3 different tiers of schools, and that's kind of your caste. You're going to kind of work that, but it separates a society to prevent you from unifying and saying, hey, we're going to be independent, right? Very smart. So the British needed resources, so all they had to do was manage the population so it wasn't going to rebel, but they didn't need to completely genocide it. So in India, you have the Victorian famines, small genocides, for example, in Bengal, where the British would move and use the food to starve out populations so that it would reduce the effectiveness of them being able to mount a counter-revolution or an independence movement. But they didn't want to wipe everybody out, because then you don't have the workers to go to the mines or cut down the trees, or being able to do those sorts of things, pick the cotton to bring it back into the metropole, which was England. So that's overseas economic colonialism. What we're talking about here in Russia and China's case, which is interesting, is that they don't need the resources. They're actually looking more for land. It's the settler, what's called settler colonialism. And there's some other terms for it, but that's the one we'll use. And what that is they want that land. And the people's connection to land, they have to break that off. And that requires 2 things that they'll have to do. Number one, the power moving in this case, Russia or China, they need to either genocide, completely eradicate the people there. In China, we see this in Xinjiang. We saw it in Manchukuo. We see it in Tibet. Just wipe out the local population, right? Get rid of them. They're dead, right? And then the ones they don't kill, you're going to assimilate. You're going to become something else, right? So in this case, this imagined Han ethnicity that the Chinese Communist Party tries to promote, this kind of standardized, new invented race, kind of like the Germans were trying to convince everybody that they were this mythical race called Aryans, right? So that was their criteria. The Chinese pretty much picked that up, incorporated it, and said, okay, that's their movement forward. And so you'll see that. So the Russians would wipe out areas or move populations around, removing them from their land, and either integrate in or completely genocide out. So the settler colonialism is primarily a very violent form of colonialism, because it's a zero-sum game, because it's seen as an ethnic form of colonialism, that you have to get this land and the other ethnicities cannot coexist with you unless they are now partners in your colonial sphere, and they begin to turn out and operate with you. So for example, the British would use Sikhs. Some groups will use different groups, so that protects you. You're no longer the sacrificial class. You're working with the group, the kind of the ruling class.
So different groups will use strategies at different times, but the end result is usually genocide, some form of genocide, and usually a physical genocide along with the cultural genocide later will occur. And that is what settler colonialism is. And you'll see that in many groups. Also with settler colonialism, there's also a religious component to it. So if there's a monotheistic religious system, and that's one of the if you can look at it from a cultural perspective, a monotheistic religious system has some drawbacks in that it's a zero-sum game, right? In other words, your way is the only way. I cannot accept any other way. So at various points throughout history, you will see, all three monotheisms, you will see Judaism, Christianity, and Islam will all three at some point be zero-sum games. In other words, when they take that land, only that religion will have that land. Very early on with Judaism, when they took over, they were told to take over what's now Palestine, but Canaan, so the land of Canaan and those lands, it was eradicate everyone. Read the Torah, the Old Testament. It was just eradicate them, right? There should be nobody else left in that land, right? Upturn their stones, everything about them, completely wipe it out. The Christians, when they took over the lands in some areas, for example, in Spain, you had to convert or get out, and then once you converted, if you started convert, you die, right? There was crusades north. So, for example, the Teutonic Knights were moving in what's now Poland. And they were doing the same thing. You had to convert or die, right? It was absolute. And then when they moved, the Crusaders moved into the Middle East in those areas, and they set up their base in Acre. They were setting up around Jerusalem. The same thing. In other words, it has to be one or the other. It cannot coexist. The two cannot coexist within the same sphere, right? They can trade. You're on the outside, and a very minimal amount of Muslims were allowed in the Christian area. Some Christians, and after that, the Muslims would not allow Christians through. That's why we had to find another way around the world, because the Muslims blocked trade to go along the Silk Road to what they saw as the kind of the Christian kingdoms in the West, because of this tension. So a lot of these dynamics occurred, and it occurs in different cultures all over the world. So if you look at India, for example, they have religions that are also opposed, diametrically opposed, and have very difficult time coexisting depending on the circumstances. And so that is another form of settler colonialism, but it is a religious settler colonialism. It is a settler of the mind colonialism. It's a culture. It's a little bit more flexible to some degree. For example, you have a very long history in the Middle East of in the Arab world, in the Caliphate, of Jews and Muslims getting along. Most Americans don't realize that before the 20th century, before the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a very syncretic relationship between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East. And so the tensions now, you'd never know. In fact, you hear that people say that, oh, well, they say they've never got along, but they have for centuries. It's just the dynamic changes, and then it becomes a zero-sum game. So it's not absolute with religion. There are times when Christians and Jews get along. There's times when Jews and Muslims get along. There's times when Muslims and Christians get along. Again, it comes down to a lot of if the resources are there and you're benefited by the other culture existing and extracting the resources. If you're the colonial power, then it tends to work. But if there's nothing that you need the other population for, genocide does tend to kind of be the way that it comes out there. They have used genocide many times to weaken a country so that a third party can come in and invade it. And so I think that's one of the things that you have to look for is in mass migrations, what will be the result? Will the result be an economic raid, an economic downturn? Will the result be shaping a foreign policy so that you're no longer in control of your foreign policy, you're benefiting a third power? You've lost your political control. Will the end result be a genocide or all of the above? So all of those are possible. All of those have been formed throughout history. We didn't get today too much into the CHICOM programs, the CCP programs, the Huaywu, but they're very vibrant, much more vibrant, like I said, orders of magnitude higher than the Soviet one. And every other nation and non-government organization has those same goals in mind, that they want an effect. They want some sort of effect from it, but usually there's a lot of blowback involved there. For example, the Russians getting involved in Serbia in the beginning of World War I, eventually the Russians collapsed because of that, because of their involvement in there. They just simply collapsed out, and it became a very, very brutal war for the Russians, and a lot of Slavs died to protect a very few Slavs down in Serbia. And so sometimes if the planners of this type of intervention We don't know what it is. So the people that are inviting other groups into their country thinking it's going to be a certain way, it could go sideways. No plan survives first contact. So you have to be very careful and understand the trajectory of history and how things don't go to plan, to understand the dangers that may encapsulate whatever policies are being enacted, whether it's intentional or unintentional. But there it is. Again, let's show this real quick here. Stop sharing. We'll show you the article over on Substack. We'll give you the, here we go. So go over to the Substack history DA at Substack. This is the article here. The links are at the bottom. Let me go back down here. So a couple links at the bottom, some really good ones that I would definitely recommend. Of course, the Army Press about the Russian diaspora, that was written in 2018, so before the current Ukrainian crisis, but they definitely predict the Ukrainian problems because they noticed how the seeding of ethnic Russians on that contact point between Ukrainians who were trying to establish their new identity and their new ethnicity and their new nationality within Ukraine was creating problems, and it did, and it created a war. It literally led to a war. One of the contributing factors that led to a war. The other one is very good. If you'll notice down here in 3, the CCP, most people don't realize how they use this imagined ethnicity to try to convince the diaspora of Asians that they are A, Chinese, and that B, that they should listen to the CCP and not their own nation that they're now citizens of, or Taiwan. And there's a couple of good ones. One of them is when China knocks at the door of New Caledonia. That's from Australians Strategic Policy Institute. That was actually pretty good about how they tend to brainwash the Chinese organizations. Government-sponsored organizations are very good at co-opting local governments so that they can get control of the ethnic Chinese and move them out of that justice system. So we've seen that a number of times, and they're just reversing or reimagining colonial policies that they have extraterritoriality by any other name, right? So what they're looking for is extraterritoriality of anyone they claim is Chinese, so that they can not protect them, but they can prosecute them and persecute them for thought crimes that are against the state of China, of the CCP. The next one this is an excellent book. It is somewhat pricey on Amazon, but definitely worth it. It's about 170, depending when you get 170, 150. And it's the Kwai Wu, the extraterritorial policies of the overseas Chinese. Phenomenal. Names, dates, places, organizations, how much funded, what was its job, who was it reporting to, the organizational structure of the CCP's overseas control operations on multiple levels, the military intelligence, the embassy, the cultural, the United Front, this evolution from the 50s and 60s when it was in competition with Taiwan to the point where it kind of knocked out Taiwan, put it aside, and then could be able to focus on controlling the narrative and the ethnic space within other countries. And that one is the most fascinating to read for me. That's really, that requires far more than just an article or a little podcast. That's really a very good book because it goes into so much detail, and it's a tremendous eye-opener for what is going on. Means, mode of opportunity, heads up, that's number one. We talk about the German-American Bunds that were here, the Nazis taking over the German-American Bund. Not even close to what these guys have. Phenomenal. And that's telling, because that much money into creating the idea of this imagined Chinese race and history shows that they are frightened about it. In other words, there's that much effort into it. That's a tremendously important policy to the CCP. And we need to apply the same standards of history to the CCP that we do for the Austro-Hungarians, for the Ottoman Empire, etc. It's just an empire made up of a number of fragmented groups that are under occupation from a Han-centric, Beijing-based power that's communist. Well, Nazi, actually, if you think about it. Some of the notes here, what did it say? The Grok AI, again, we're continuing use of artificial intelligence, mostly Grok 3 right now, in assisting in investigating. I mentioned the last live stream that we did on Friday that some of this information that we put out was we have to verify it, right? So part of the thought process is let's see how AI is doing. And AI does have its problems. It's still a 12-year-old child, a 13-year-old child, a genius 13-year-old child, but nevertheless one that's prone to mistakes and intentional errors and unintentional errors. In this case, what we did was we said we weren't sure where that video from Elon Musk comes from. And we said, okay, where did it come from? And his initial answers, actually based upon kind of the group scan of some of the tweets within X, or posts within X, said it was from the AFD, I think of January 25th, where Elon Musk spoke to the German AFD rally, and his visage was up on the screen. And he kind of gave him a pep talk. Well, it didn't look the same to me. I mean, there was a lot of similar elements. On the hand, it was kind of there, but there's enough there that I'm like, wait a minute. So we ask again, can you compare the two, like we did with the Fletcher class destroyer and Iwo Jima with that live stream? We actually worked on that to compare archival film, so we could kind of say, is this film from here? And now can we identify it off the coast of Iwo Jima in World War II with a Fletcher class destroyer doing a shore bombardment or ground support role, fire support role? And we went through that to see what AI can see and that sort of thing. So visual comparison. So we used that with Elon Musk, and it came up with, well, it's not convincing yet. It's not overwhelming evidence. This isn't from it. There's some elements there. So which is good. That's what we asked it for. And finally, we narrowed it down. Okay, it's from Spain. We actually went outside. We saw some items. One of the things that's excellent is sometimes in the post, people have the answer already. So, and in this, when Grok was able to translate Italian language posts very quickly within seconds and give us a response, and in those posts, we identified, here's a lead. They say it's a political rally from this group, and it was taken actually just a couple days ago. So we validated that information, looked outside, said, oh, yep, that's it. There it is. But that could have taken us hours without Grok. So in that case, it's very useful. But his initial answer that it was probably the AFD rally in January, which was easily disprovable when you look at the two videos, and then the content of what he said in Germany versus what he said in Italy, okay, those are different. So keep in mind, you still have to treat it like an assistant, a human assistant, a good 13-year-old, smart, really, willing to help, can get some information very quickly, but is prone to making mistakes and is prone to do that. Again, use the historyda.org protocol, ask him for that, and he'll be much more impartial and rational. If we didn't say it in the beginning, sometimes he'll fudge answers, but if we say historyda.org, he'll notify us, this is the base answer, and then I'm going to infer something else. If you don't use that, sometimes he'll just say that's the answer, but he's actually inferred it. He's actually kind of guessing or predicting rather than giving you a solid answer, what he can prove. So that's an important part with the historyda.org protocol on Grok. If you say it, he'll notify you, this is what I know, and I'm going to make an assumption based on the pattern of what it might be, but it's not confirmed. And then you can go through the confirmation process or put it out as the most likely. So that's good. Grok AI is still proving pretty good, actually. Some of the numbers now in the Confucius Institutes and the Ruski Mir, they're dwindling because they were exposed. The Confucius Institutes, basically, they for about 4 or 5 years, they've been the focus. So they've changed the language, they've changed the cultural, they're kind of moving about to try to escape detection. And some of the universities that had contracts with them have stopped. Thankfully, a lot of groups are starting to reinforce the memory that there was a genocide in China, huge genocide, and there was huge human rights violations within the CCP occupied Asia. And so some universities, wanted to kind of avoid that. And so they've dropped them. But they're still out there, they're still moving. So the numbers that we show for both the Confucius Institutes and the Ruski Mir are altering and shifting. But pay attention to those are the dates when those were there, but we don't know the date. We don't know the exact number currently because they've shifted their name, and it would require a much deeper dive to get those accurate numbers. But it will give you a good number for roughly 2019 for the Confucius Institutes, and about 2020 for Ruski Mir. Ruski Mir, when the Ukrainian war kicked off, that's when the pressure and the political spotlight started to hit the Ruski Mir foundations here in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. And then they kind of reduced. That's when they kind of went to ground and began to kind of hide their operations because of the negative publicity for Ukraine. CCP, that occurred a little bit earlier, but both were kind of the same. They were overt until it's politically not expedient and they're down. So the numbers might be a little bit off. Finally, go over to the historyda.org website. And the exciting part is if you go into, let's do it right here so we can show you. That's the magic of this video. All right, so I'm going to do stop sharing here. We are going to share again. And I want to show you this. It's a source docs that we collected a long time ago on the FBI created they had a task force that would look at, or a department, I should say, that looked at the foreign influence operations within the United States. And so I'm going to do this. Should have been already set up. My apologies. But again, I'm an investigator, not a presenter. So there we go. All right, where is it? There we go. Historical Detective Agency. Okay, nope, that's not it. All right, so what this is, here we go. So if you go over to our website here, we haven't yet uploaded the weaponized migration yet. We go over here, and if you go up here to Evidence Locker, and then go down here to America 1931 to 1941. What Evidence Locker is just source docs we see that we think are interesting. We put them up here so that you can look at these source docs and take a look for yourself. And these we found the most useful so far. If we see others, go to the National Archives. These are ones we're kind of worried that they may disappear, or we have physical copies with us, and then we scan those physical copies in because they may not be at the National Archives or things like that. So make sure to click on the picture. And what these are basically quarter summary of the FBI National Defense Investigation, November 15, 1940, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 2 is just the graphics. So think of this like an early PowerPoint. Here it is, and then they had these big boards that came up. When you go to the archives and look at some of these, they're just these little cardboard, big gigantic posters that they'll show. So it's kind of neat. It's the same principle as a PowerPoint. But here we go. Hopefully this will show up. And let's make sure you guys can see this because it opens up another PDF. And nope. All right, so we're going to stop this real quick. We're going to have to do another screen to show the actual. Here we go. So this is again 1940, so before the war, and what we're looking at is a tremendous report. So the first thing you're going to see is this is over 100 pages here. It's like 300, I think. I'll go back and look, but basically you're looking at the foreign nationals. So they're looking at Japan, Italy, and Germany, and then they do actually do France because remember France went Vichy. So suddenly you'll see that in depending on the time of the report, they include France in on this because France had fallen to the Nazis. So if Britain had fallen, then all of a sudden all these British ones would come into play again, and also communists. So the Communist International, the Russians, they're looking at. So 1940 was a very tough year internally for the United States because you had the potential for the Japanese, the Italians, the Germans, the Russians, and the French. So a huge slice was there, and all of them. So the Russians at that time, the Soviets were focused more in America. They were focused more on the ideology of it, right? So they're focused more on the socialist utopian nonsense. So they were kind of focused on that. The Germans were focusing heavily on the ethnic and trying to recruit anybody that was in this imagined Aryanism, or actually in the United States, there were a tremendous number of German immigrants, German-speaking immigrants. So basically in the United States, they used that as kind of a metric, except for the tremendous amount of German Jews and Jews that spoke Yiddish, and mostly, Yiddish is mostly German. And so those culturally ones from what was Prussia then became Poland, make sure I can say that straight, and then Russia, they had ties with their fathers and grandfathers to Germany. But after World War I, those had gotten cut off, and then now they're refugees. And it would progress through the war because 1939, Poland, so you had a number of Poland. Some of them were Russians, some of them were Prussian, Germans, some of them were Polish, just depending where they were. So it was really a mixed match. So it was very difficult sometimes to separate, and that actually proved a vulnerability because the United States eventually, and Britain eventually, wisely recognized that the German Jewish Americans, even though they had fought very valiantly and patriotically, as you'll see in the other article on historydi.org, for the German Empire, of course, they were marginalized in the Nazi German Empire, but they were very good assets to be able to infiltrate and get back into and use as clandestine agents and informants within the Germans because they spoke the language. They had grown up. You couldn't tell, right? It's like there's just no way because they had grown up German for 1,000 years, some cases almost 2,000 years. They were there from the Roman times, and so they had adopted German culture. And then the emancipation within Germany had been probably about 100 years at that point, depending what city you're in and what kingdom. So that was useful. But here again, you can see that in this document, there's a tremendous amount of influence operations. And look at what the FBI is looking at, and you'll see that some of these groups were designed to create, for example, exacerbate racial strife. They wanted to get into the white black. They wanted to get into the Mexican white, the Mexican black. They were looking at being able to divide along racial lines the United States, and these were the foreign influence groups. So they understood the dynamics within the America. They understood how to play those in order to be able to further their goals overseas, whether they were the Nazis, the communists, the Italians, that sort of thing. The Italians wasn't that much, but they were worried about money being sent over. And so you'll see a lot of the smaller groups, and there's a tremendous amount of groups, a tremendous amount of membership. So the communist was the most difficult because it wasn't ethnic. So you had to get an ideology. The ethnic groups was a little easier. The Japanese much more so because the Germans had been in America's some cases since the 1600s, and they'd come over mostly in the 1850s. There was a huge group, and then the 1880s was kind of the peak, and it kind of stopped out there. And then the rest of them were political refugees, mostly from 1930, so they were easily identifiable. But they had most of them had blended in, right? So how do you determine what that person identifies with? Do they believe they're more German than American? So it was very difficult, especially because Woodrow Wilson during World War I had actually done a pogrom, and in some ways against German Americans, where German language was banned, German culture was banned. Actually, if you look at the book Burning Beethoven, is a pretty good primer on that period of time. And there was actually German Americans and one German that was lynched in America. Because they were perceived as this suddenly racial enemy, and even Americans of German descent turned and refused to be German. That's World War I. So they were worried about a backblast after the World War because it turned out to be kind of America's first Vietnam was World War I, wasn't popular, and so they were looking at that. So that's this. Actually, let's go to the other one. But you'll see it's a tremendous amount of information that they have going through here. We're already at 272 pages. 305 pages. So there's a tremendous amount of investigation into foreign influence operations within the United States. This is in 1940. Now imagine now and this is controlled immigration up to this point. In fact, we almost went to war with Japan. Well, there was a tension with Japan because we had stopped the ability of the Japanese to be able to immigrate to the United States. And we had stopped that. We also stopped with the Manchu Empire. We'd cut off the immigration from those groups. So we had immigration controls. In fact, we wouldn't allow Jews in the United States for a while. So that was and even with that situation, it was tough to manage. It was a big law enforcement and intelligence operation to keep track of all that and to protect the United States' vital interests. Now you have 10 million or more, 20 million. I mean, what's the number? We don't even know. And imagine these paperwork now, what's required now to be able to understand how do we protect our assets in this time. So we're going to do one more here real quick. Actually, let me do this first. So we're going to open up the charts because that's a little easier to see. It's a little better. All right, go to share screen. And there we go. This is the part 2. All right, here we go. And we'll add that. There we go. A little hard to see, and I'll work on this presentation later. But this is so here you have the Communist Party, you have where they were, you have their cells identified, you had their group of the geographical organization, how they would work it out. And depending, it was different. So there's a couple different groups. So they would, in the United States, they considered some labor organizations pro-US, some labor organizations anti-US. Russian foreign-born residents in the United States. This is a census in 1930. Remember, it was every 10 years, and they'd have the numbers there. So you can see kind of the concentration of where the percentage of the Russians were that they would have to focus on. Because some Russians were also, they weren't ideological opponents of communism. They saw it also as Russian. So there were a few of those, but not many. It was still white Russian versus red Russian. So, but they still wanted to find out where that large population was because the communists could move within that. The Japanese, there's the population breakdown there. French, as I said, because it was a Vichy state, so they had now start tracking the French. And then, of course, there's the Italian Americans are there, and then the German Americans, right? And then these are some of the organizations. So similar to the Russian groups, the Confucius Institute groups, that you would use culture as a means of entry and a means of manipulation and shaping. Not all cultural organizations were, but the German American Bund was, the Confucius Institutes were, and that sort of thing. So just realizing that was part of what they would look at. So it's fascinating to see. This one was like 25, 26 pages. Even up in Alaska, they're looking at all of these sorts of things that the FBI would have to look at. And the FBI realized it would have to grow, expand, and create field offices all over the place to manage this, to be able to get that intel to look at it. So again, imagine the transformation. This is what happened, what the organizational structure they needed back then to manage this problem. It's tremendous now, right? Think about it, right? Just on the scale. So that's kind of, and that gives you an idea. Again, that's over here. It's on the evidence locker, American 1931 to 1941. and it's these two documents from the FBI to give you a good idea about historically when we looked at some of the migration, and that wasn't even a mass migration. That wasn't a mass, forced unvetted migration. That was just what was slipping through the cracks at the time. And so, that's something to think about that is probably very important, right? Oh, there's my background. Look at that. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Again, weaponized migration it's not a conspiracy theory. It literally has occurred in the past, is occurring now. It has a long history through multiple cultures and with multiple outcomes and multiple motives. Everything from the complete eradication of the other group through a genocide, either a physical genocide or a complete absorption and a genocide of the other group's culture, or a raid, economic destruction. It could be just violence, up to shaping and eventually taking over the nation and using you as an economic slave, right? Because you got to go chop the wood, you have to go mine the mines, you've got to go pick the cotton, you've got to work in the bordellos. So that's something to think about. In that this is not, unfortunately, this is not anything new. This is established practice. Russia has been doing this since the Tsarist times. It's why Russia is Russia, and the borders it has is because it was very effective at moving forward migration and advancing their national interest as part of migration in colonizing and conquest. So, and the Chinese have picked that up, and they're very good at it. And the Chinese are good at getting inside the mind, and they're going to use the diaspora. They are using it today, as the Russians are, to use the diaspora for their own national interest, their own expansion interest, and their own conquest. So keep that in mind when you see the tweets. And Elon Musk says, there's a group of Italians teleported. Well, that's good for that environment, but reality is there's a lot more examples that are much more frightening than a bunch of Italians being transported in or transported out, or a bunch of people teleported to Italy. It sounds like Star Trek, but in reality, it can be a brutal process. It can be a very deadly process, and many genocides in the past have occurred because of that process. And why the United States is doing it now, who knows? That's for historians to kind of decide if they're around in 20 to 30 years, and they go back and look at the records and figure out why that occurred. But it's nothing new. It's been going on. It's just now that the United States tends to be a target, but we've forgotten history and forgotten what the consequences may be. Again, if there's any questions, feel free to put in the comments below. We do check all our channels. Facebook, we're on Facebook, we're on X, we're on Substack, and we have our own page where the blogs are there. Feel free to put them on anyone, or go to, you can send them to me at hq@historyda.org. We try to answer everything that comes in. And if there's a topic that you're interested in, feel free to go ahead and send that to us. We can investigate it if we have the ability. If not, we have a pretty good network of folks that we can send it to a specialist and they can take a look at it. If you have a certain project, if you have a real world investigation, we also have secure point investigation. So it's the real world private investigators that can go out and kind of find those answers in real time versus the archives. But we do use archives for a lot of investigations as well. But we're solving problems in the past and present so we can make a better future and hopefully reduce some of the problems that we're going to encounter. Always remember to study history. Always remember to keep looking to the past to understand your future. And and one more announcement is we're going to start looking at Herbert Hoover, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about Herbert Hoover, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, what tariffs are in the Great Depression. We've seen a lot of misinformation about that. So we're going to go back and we've been working on the Hoover Project actually for a little while. The War and Peace Studies Institute, we get a lot of material for that, the Hoover Institution. We were working on that because he grew up actually down here in Oregon. He was an orphan, worked the night shift in Oregon as he went to school as a teenager, and he left his initials. So we started a project about eight weeks ago, but we didn't realize that he would come back into the forefront here as kind of an artificial villain in the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that sent America into the Great Depression. So that's being revised again, and we need to kind of address what are the actual historical facts on that say. What are tariffs? Where have tariffs been in the United States history? And again, we try not to talk too much about modern politics, but we will give you the information, the documentation on the past, so that you can make your better decisions about what's going on in the present to make the future better. So again, my name is Al Johnson. Thank you very much for listening. This has been the Historical Detective Agency Monday Talk, April 7th, 2025. Have a great night and be safe.
past, investigated. Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would.